My name is Richard Watts. I'm the faculty director of the Canadian Studies Center in the Jackson School of International Studies here at the University of Washington. And I want to thank you for joining us today. The Jackson School acknowledges that we are on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and other Indigenous peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples across the world. This is also the occasion, it seems to me, to acknowledge Indigenous languages, including a local language, Southern Lushatseed, and the primary language of the Arctic, Inuktitut, both of which, it's worth noting, are taught at the University of Washington. I'd also like to acknowledge the gracious support of our sponsors, which include the Western Association of Canadian Studies, recently renamed, the University of Northern British Columbia, Boise State University, and the Canadian Studies Center in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies, that's to say us. So we're very much looking forward to this event. I'm going to turn it over to Ross Burkhart, Professor of Political Science at Boise State University and Executive Director of the Western Association of Canadian Studies, who will introduce our speaker, Gary Wilson, and my colleague Nadine Fabi. So with that, Ross, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rich, and welcome to everyone. We're very excited. This is our first Meet the Author event. We're going to have another one I should advertise quickly. Don Alper will be speaking about his new book on a history of Canadian studies at Western Washington University. That'll be at 10 a.m. Pacific time on Friday, May the 21st. So you'll want to put that on your calendar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our colleague and friend, Dr. Gary Wilson. He is a professor of political science at the University of Northern British Columbia. He'll be speaking today. Dr. Nadine Fabi from the University of Washington, Managing Director of the Canadian Studies Center, will be the the leader of our discussion at the end of Gary's presentation. Gary will have a presentation of about half an hour or so. So Gary Wilson, as I said, Professor of Political Science, University of Northern British Columbia, also our outgoing Vice President of the Western Association of Canadian Studies, the coordinator of the Northern Studies Program and the Local Government Administration Certificate Program at the University of Northern British Columbia. He wears a lot of hats and he's published some books as well. In fact, his latest book, Nested Federalism and Inuit Governance in the Canadian Arctic, is the subject of today's presentation. Gary, I'm going to let you take it away and we'll enjoy this talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Rich and Ross, for those very kind introductions. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Tlaikletane Nation, and it's the nation on whose territory, unceded traditional territory, I live and work. I'm very honored to be the first presenter in this speaker series offered by the new Western Association of Canadian Studies. So thank you to the association and to my colleagues in the association, Ross and Morna McEachern and Nadine Fabi and others, and also to the Canadian Studies Center at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington for inviting me to present today and for co-hosting today's presentation. This book, Nested Federalism and Inuit Governance in the Canadian Arctic, would never have been possible without the contributions of many people and organizations. First, my co-authors, Chris Alcantara from the University of Western Ontario in Ontario, and Thierry Rodon from Université Laval in Quebec. We've worked together now for about 10 years, and this book is the culmination and the product of a lot of that work. And along the way, we've collaborated on various grant applications and conference presentations, journal articles, book chapters. And I'm very grateful to have had two such committed, hardworking, intelligent, and perceptive collaborators to work with. I'd also like to mention the support that we received from our universities and from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC. This was critical to the success of the research process. It funded travel for field work, and conferences. It funded student support for graduate student researchers and so on, and also grant administration. And then lastly, but most importantly, I think I'd like to acknowledge the involvement of various senior government officials at the regional, provincial, territorial, and federal levels who shared their insights on these evolving regions that are the focus of the book. These are very busy people, and we're really grateful that they took time out of their busy schedules to inform with us, to meet with us, to enlighten us on the political, economic, and social dynamics of these regions and the relationships that they have with other levels of government in Canada. These insights were really critical to the success of the book project. So to get us started, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this works. Okay, everybody see that? Okay, good. So to get us started, this is a book about nested Inuit regions in the Canadian Arctic, and I'll talk a little bit later about what that means. But it's also a book about their complicated relationships that exist between these regions and other levels of government within the Canadian federal system. And I think it goes without saying that when the Canadian federal system was created in the 1860s, Indigenous people, including Inuit, were not consulted or included in those discussions. In fact, in the constitutional division of powers, they and their lands were deemed to be wards of the federal government. And it wasn't until well over 100 years later that this situation started to change. And Inuit have been at the forefront of these changes. They've been pushing governments at all levels for greater autonomy and recognition, all in an effort to achieve self-determination. So this book really is the story of this process as it's unfolded over the last 50 years or so. So the specific context of the book, I'm trying to advance my slide here, but it's not working. Let me try again. There we go. So the specific context of the book centers around a paradoxical situation involving the Canadian federal system on the one hand, and Indigenous demands for a place within this system. And despite a number of attempts at reform over the years to accommodate Indigenous self-government, this system has been highly resistant to change. At the same time, more recently, the system has been flexible in allowing for the negotiation and creation of new governance arrangements that parallel some of the formal structures that exist within this system. And speaking in particular of Inuit demands for change and adaptation, it's important to note that much of the hard work and innovation around these new governance systems has come from Inuit peoples and in particular their leaders. The Canadian federal system has not been easily flexible. It has taken decades of persistence and determination on the part of Inuit to carve out a place for themselves within the Canadian political system. And this is an ongoing process that is met with much resistance at times and a number of setbacks, but also a number of surprising sources of support and a number of advances, which I'll try to get to today. So I wanted to start by outlining some of the key concepts that we use in the book, and in the title, Nested Federalism and Inuit Governance, those are the two main concepts that we try to get at. So let's start with nested federalism. This is what has been characterized as a type of federal governance in which autonomous regions are situated politically and geographically within existing and constitutionally recognized provinces and territories. So it draws its inspiration, I think, from the Russian nesting dolls that you see in the picture beside the definition there. And actually, in a previous academic life, I was a Russian studies specialist. I did my PhD in Russian politics at the University of Toronto. And this is where I first came into sort of contact with these nested or matryoshka regions, regions where there are kind of multiple levels of regional governance happening in the same region. And I think the nesting doll analogy is very appropriate, in part because the regions I'm going to be talking about today are unique, singular, autonomous regions, but they also fit within other larger regions, and that's the notion of the nested federalism or nesting doll notion. The other concept that we look at is this idea of Inuit governance, and the way that we use this concept as political scientists refers to the different political and institutional models that have emerged in Canada and in other circumpolar jurisdictions such as Greenland and northeastern Alaska. Inuit live in 4 different countries across the circumpolar north, and so the Canadian Inuit are just one example of different political institutional models. And these models exist in regions where Inuit constitute a majority of the population. So some of the more well-known examples are Nunavik and Greenland, and you see their flags on the side there. Nunavik is a territory within the Canadian Federation. Greenland is a proto-state. It's probably the closest you'll come to an Inuit country or state without actually being a full-blown state. So they're 2 examples of these types of institutional models that have emerged. I'll be talking about some of the other types, these nested regions today. So here you have a map of Inuit Nunavik. This is the Inuit homeland in Canada. And you see the 4 different Inuit regions there. From west to east, we have the Inuit settlement region in the Northwest Territories. We have Nunavik, as I mentioned, a territory within the Canadian Federation in the Eastern Arctic. We have Nunavik, which is in the top third of the province of Quebec. And we have Nunatsiavut, which is in northern Labrador in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So 3 of these 4 regions, as you probably gathered from that very brief overview, are nested within existing provinces and territories in the Canadian federal system. So Inuit settlement region, Nunavik and Nunatsiavut, and they are the focus of this study. Unlike Nunavik, which is a standalone territory, the ability of these regions to exercise autonomy is constrained by their jurisdictional relationship with their respective provincial and territorial governments, and to a lesser extent, the federal government. But what we found as a result of doing this research, that the most important relationship that these regions have is with their respective provincial or territorial governments. And that's evolved over time as the federal government has backed away from these regions and the provincial and territorial governments have become important. It's also a function too that, as I'll get to later, that many of the policy areas that these regions seek to control and administer are provincial or territorial areas of jurisdiction. So that's where their focus has been. There was a lot of discussion about, when we were going through the writing of the book, about why we weren't including Nunavut, and it's simply because we don't see it as a nested region. It is a standalone territory that has territorial status within the Canadian Federation. None of the other regions have that kind of a status. So from this kind of overview of Inuit governance, we developed 3 basic kind of categories of Inuit governance, with Inuit governance being kind of an umbrella term. The first is Inuit self-government, which is a set of regional government institutions that are controlled by a particular Inuit group within a territorially defined space. So a singular government that is controlled by Inuit, and where Inuit are the ones who participate in running for political office, who vote in elections, and so on. We also see evidence of public governments. Both, Nunavik and Nunavut have public governments, so regional governments that are open to all citizens within a defined territory, regardless of their ethnic identity. Of course, in all of these regions, the vast majority of the population are Inuit, but there are some non-Inuit living in these regions. So public governments serve their needs as well as the Inuit citizens. And then lastly, Inuit self-governance, which are institutions that exist outside of the scope of government, but play a really important political and economic role at the regional level. And the one set of institutions that jump out in this regard are some of the land claims organizations or Inuit development corporations, Makivik Corporation, the Anivia regional corporations. These are not governments per se, but they do play a very important governance role, political role, and economic role at the regional level. So if we look at the four regions, the four Inuit regions in Canada, we see quite a diversity of these different types. Nunatsiavut in Labrador, we have an amalgamated Inuit self-government, right? So there's the Nunatsiavut government. Only Inuit beneficiaries are allowed to run for office within that government, and at the regional level are allowed to vote for political candidates in elections. So this is really kind of an ethnically based government structure. In Nunavik, as I said, there's kind of a hybrid of public government or public administrative institutions, the Kativik regional government, for example, or the Kativik school board. And then Inuit governance institutions like the Makivik Corporation, which, as I mentioned, plays a really important political as well as economic role in the region. Nunavut, the same thing. You have a territorial government, which is a public government, but you also have Inuit self-government institutions, the land claims organization, Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, which exist alongside the territorial government. And then lastly, the Anivia settlement region, which is really just Inuit self-governance institutions, mainly through the Anivia Regional Corporation. There is no kind of regional government or regional administrative bodies in the ISR. So you see quite a diversity. And one of the aims of the book is to try to explain why this diversity exists, right? Why we have this variation. So that takes me to the research questions. So the two research questions, the first, as I just mentioned, is what explains the variation in institutional design that is found in the governance structures of these three nested Inuit regions. And do these varied institutional designs produce patterns of Inuit autonomy and public policy that are different from the traditional intergovernmental logic of the Canadian federal system? So in other words, traditionally intergovernmental relations in Canada has been dominated by the federal and provincial and later territorial governments. Do we see, these regions becoming part of that dynamic? Are they able to exercise autonomy from these other levels of government? Do we see the emergence of a more multi-level system of governance coming into being? So that brings us to the theoretical frameworks. The two that we draw on are probably familiar to people who study federalism and also political scientists. The first is historical institutionalism. We use this as a way to explain how these regions came into being and what factors led to their creation and led to the variation between them. So historical institutionalism focuses on the important role that institutions, meaning rules and laws and norms within the political system, play in structuring political outcomes. And one of the important things that historical institutionalism emphasizes are critical junctures. So these kind of important events that lead to the establishment of new institutions, and then the path dependencies that those institutions create. And we think that will help us to explain why this variation exists. On a second level, the second question, we use something called multi-level politics. And this is an innovation that my colleague Chris Alcantara came up with. So as I mentioned, traditionally, intergovernmental relations has been the most important dynamic within the Canadian federal system. This focuses on the relationship between the federal government and the provincial governments, and more recently, the territorial governments. They are the ones who control decision-making. They are the ones who have constitutional jurisdiction over policy. They control administration. But at the same time, we also see the emergence of multi-level governance within Canada and internationally, for that matter. Multi-level governance is a new concept that's coming into being to kind of explain the expansion of governance that's taken place over the last 20 or 30 years. And this recognizes the important roles that non-traditional governance actors play in policymaking. That could be municipal governments, it could be Indigenous governments, it could be Indigenous governance institutions. We see all of these actors playing a more important role in policymaking and administration and decision-making, and multi-level governance tries to capture that expansion of governance. So we're moving from a system which focuses on government to a system that is much broader in scope and takes into consideration all of these new and interesting governance actors. Just a few words on our research methodology. So the research, as I just explained, draws on some of the established theories and concepts that have been used by political scientists to describe and explain the evolution of governance models and policies in other jurisdictions. But it was also obviously informed by primary and secondary sources, academic articles, government reports at all levels, and media. And most importantly, I think interviews with senior officials at the regional and the provincial and territorial and federal levels. Those were critical in terms of providing us with insights into how these regions were evolving and what they were doing. The project went through 6 different ethic review processes, 3 at each university and 3 at the regional levels. So before we could even start the research, we had to go through those processes and get approval. So just getting more into depth on nested federalism. Since the 1970s, we've seen that Inuit peoples in the Canadian Arctic have established all of these varied governance systems. And that allows them to exercise varying degrees of autonomy over a range of public policy areas. And these governance systems have emerged mainly, if you look at all of the Inuit regions in Canada, as a result of the negotiation of comprehensive land claims agreements, right? The modern treaties and subsequent agreements that have led to these sort of different types of institutional structures and differences in the types of autonomy that they exercise. So for most of these regions, the kind of critical junctures were the kind of processes that led up to those land claims agreements. And as I'll explain later on, one of the most important features was the kind of a lot of the resource development projects that pushed the negotiation of these land claims agreements. So that's the starting point for this story. When we talk about the development of regional governance structures, we see that they're influenced by a combination of factors. Institutional factors, what we might call institutional factors. These are, obviously the embedded or nested nature of these regions within other provinces or territories. That is a key institutional feature that defines their level of autonomy and the autonomy they're able to exercise. but also kind of the rules around what could be included in land claims and negotiations and the contents of land claims agreements. One of the most important features that we saw was, that some of the earlier land claims agreements, like the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement or the Inuit Final Agreement, you were not allowed to include a self-government chapter in those agreements. You had to negotiate self-government after you had finalized your land claim agreement. So that sort of set Nunavik and Inuit along a different path than, say, Nunatsiavut, which by the time they negotiated their land claim agreement, you were allowed to include a self-government chapter, right? So they could negotiate self-government and a land claims agreement at the same time in parallel. And that really affected how those regions evolved. So these kinds of rules and the changes to the rules were really important and important institutional factors or variables. But there's also the non-institutional factors, right? I've mentioned some of the exogenous shocks, right? Major resource developments that kind of pushed this process along. Of course, the evolving political context. None of these regions exist in a vacuum. They have to deal with the political context in their provinces or territories and at the federal level. Nunavik's a good example of this, right? It's trying to negotiate its own self-government agreements at the same time as Quebec nationalism and separatism is affecting the politics in the province as a whole. So there's that context which is important, and also key individuals. We shouldn't forget that these agreements were negotiated by people. And from various different backgrounds and different levels of government, and we see the role of individuals in both positive and negative ways. Sometimes key politicians and actors are trying to stall the process, and other times they're really trying to push it along. And there've been a number of good examples of this in all of these different cases. So I'll just provide some brief overviews of each of the regions to talk about their evolution. So starting with Nunavik, as I mentioned, this Nunavik sort of emerged out of the negotiation of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975, which was Canada's first modern treaty, right? Treaties hadn't been signed since the 1920s, and the JBNQA was the first one. In fact, when they negotiated the JBNQA, there was no template for how to negotiate a treaty, and they actually used the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act as a kind of an example of how to go about negotiating and what to include in these treaties. So it's quite interesting that sort of circumpolar context comes into play. In Nunavik, the JBNQA led to the establishment of both regional administrative bodies. So I mentioned the Nunavik Regional Government. That's one set of institutions, but also these kind of land claims organizations like the Makivik Corporation, right? And, since then, this is 50 years later or so, there's been several unsuccessful attempts to create an amalgamated government for Nunavik. And those have been unsuccessful. They've gone to referendum and consultation, and there's been a lot of political energy that have gone into those negotiations and those discussions. But that's sort of where we're at. We're sort of still with the same structure that existed 50 years ago. They haven't managed to change that structure in any significant way. In the Inuit settlement region, this came out of something called the Inuit Final Agreement, which was signed in 1984. And this established a set of regional governance bodies, but these kind of self-governance bodies, right? The Inuit Regional Corporation, which is really kind of the equivalent of the Makivik Corporation. It's an Inuit-controlled development corporation. There was, interestingly, a failed attempt to create a joint regional model with the Gwich'in, another Indigenous group in this part of the Northwest Territories, kind of a Beaufort Delta regional government, but it fell apart in the early 2000s. And since then, the Inuvialuit have been negotiating to try to have their own self-government arrangement, but nothing has emerged from that yet. And then lastly, Nunatsiavut. So this came out of the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement. This was signed in 2005. It was the kind of the most recent Inuit land claims agreement. And as I mentioned, although the Labrador Inuit had to wait a long time for their agreement to be signed, by the time they got around to negotiating it, the rules had changed, and that allowed them to include a self-government chapter. All right, so they were able to not only deal with their land claims issues, but they were also able to create a unified amalgamated government structure, and that became the Nunatsiavut government. And it's a regional government. It has both regional and community levels, but also different branches of government too. So it's quite a comprehensive model. So switching now to multi-level politics, the second part of the book looks at the dynamics of multi-level politics in each region, and our analysis of policymaking and administration in each of the regions focuses on a number of key policy areas: housing, education, and resource management and development. These are all areas which are of significance to these regions. Housing is a huge challenge for many of these regions, as you're probably aware. Education speaks to the importance of capacity building, but also the preservation of culture and language. And resource management and resource development obviously speaks to the importance of environmental issues, but also having economic activity to kind of fund all of the services that regional governments provide. So we sort of in consultation and listening to the officials we were speaking to, we decided to focus on these particular areas to sort of see if there's evidence of these regions having some degree of autonomy over decision-making and administration in each of these important areas. So what the research revealed was that there, in fact, is both types of multi-level politics that exist in these areas to varying degrees, intergovernmental relations and these sort of more multi-level governance arrangements. The dominant pattern is still very much intergovernmental, with the provincial and the territorial governments continuing to play a key role in the administration of the regions. That was very clear. However, there was some evidence that the regions are increasingly able to exercise some control over decision-making and program implementation at the regional level. We refer to this not as sort of full-blown multi-level governance, but more as instances of multi-level governance. So I'll go through each region and give you a few examples. So Nunavik is the oldest and the most complicated regional governance structure. The organizations like the Kativik Regional Government, the Kativik School Board, the Nunavik Regional Board of Health and Social Services are very deeply embedded in the provincial system, right? They sort of they are connected to these kind of provincial silos, stretching up to the ministries at the provincial level that are in control of these policy areas. So we see these very distinct intergovernmental relationships and patterns. At the same time, we see, there's evidence that, in areas like education, for example, the Kativik School Board has been able to carve out a degree of autonomy for itself and to promote things like Inuktitut and cultural programming at the local level. So that would be evidence of more sort of multi-level governance. There's also, given the fact that Nunavik has been a region since the mid-1970s, there's been a lot of administrative and political capacity building that's gone on in that region. And that's really a really important point, right? Is that if the regions are going to exercise autonomy, they also have to have the kind of administrative, political, and financial capacity to do so. But going back to something I said earlier, it's been a very difficult political environment in Quebec over the years. We all know the politics of Quebec nationalism and on questions of language, right? So controversial in that province in particular. So the fact that the Nunavik has been able to carve out this autonomy in that kind of a context is I think a really important development. Looking at the Anivia settlement region, I would say this is the least developed governance structure. We have a land claims organization, but without a regional government or administration. But we do see sort of strong Anivia influence in resource management. There are very well embedded co-management bodies that bring together all of the different actors from local to federal to kind of manage resource matters in the region. Graham White's book, recent book on co-management, is probably something you might want to read if you want to know more about this. So we're seeing this kind of multi-level governance structure emerging in resource management, but also areas such as education around things like Inuit programming and so on. But one of the things that complicates the situation in Nunavik is the fact that only recently the territory has received devolved powers from the federal government. So I think there's kind of a reluctance in some ways on the part of the territorial government to further devolve administration and control to other levels of government, and that complicates matters. And then lastly, before I get to some concluding thoughts, Nunatsiavut. So despite being the last Inuit region to sign a treaty, Nunatsiavut benefited from being able to include a self-government chapter in their land claim agreement. So in some ways, they're further along than the two other regions. And in theory, the land claims agreement provides the Nunatsiavut government with very broad-ranging powers. But in practice, the Nunatsiavut government has chosen not to draw down those powers. I think in part due to a lack of capacity to exercise them, right? It doesn't want to do that too early. But we do see some very encouraging signs, right? I mean, when we first started the research, the Nunatsiavut government had no interest in running its own housing authority for the region. Just before the book was published, it created its own housing authority. So over the course of 6 years or so, it was able to sort of feel comfortable in itself that it was able to take on those powers that were outlined in the land claims agreement. So just a few conclusions. I mean, the most obvious one is, despite facing some very significant barriers and challenges, and I haven't really gotten into detail about a lot of these, Inuit peoples in Canada have developed a series of very innovative governance structures that are starting to challenge these rigid institutional boundaries of the Canadian federal system. Provincial and territorial governments are still key actors within an intergovernmental context, in part because they have constitutional jurisdiction over a lot of these policy areas. But that said, we see instances of multi-level governance. We see instances where these regions are able to exercise some real autonomy, but it's not full-blown autonomy. That is something for the future. An important variable is capacity. Human, financial, administrative, that will play a very important role in determining whether these regions are able to take on these powers and that are outlined in their self-government agreements in some cases. So the relevance of the Inuit experience, I think, in this idea of nested federalism is, there is some relevance to other Indigenous regions that are emerging in Canada that are the result of successful land claims and self-government agreements. And we see that across much of the North, actually, where treaties were not signed, but have subsequently been negotiated. But I think the challenge for the non-Inuit governments, non-Indigenous governments, is to work with Indigenous peoples to develop innovative new governance arrangements that entrench and respect Indigenous autonomy, but more importantly, provide pathways for Indigenous representation within the broader political system more generally, right? It's sort of the two halves of a federal system. One is to provide autonomy, but also one is to make sure that those regions and units are represented at, say, a provincial or a national level. So that will be the big challenge, I think, for the non-Indigenous governments moving forward. So thank you very much. I apologize if I've gone a little bit over time, but I've really appreciated the opportunity to share the research and the book with all of you, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Gary. I just want to say the contribution that this book is making to the field, you know, prior to this, I think we've had, I mean, there's a modest body of literature. It's a very rich body of literature. And I think you've been at the helm of much of that, but to now have a complete volume here that will be used in political science classes and Arctic studies classes is just a profound contribution to the field. So I really want to thank you and the authors for the time and dedication and all the different peoples that you met with along the way to produce this volume. It seems to me that it'll be something we'll now be responding to in the field. So thank you, and for a rich presentation. I'll just begin with a question, then we'll open it up to everyone. The question I have is, you talk about how Indigenous demands have reshaped the politics of Canada, and engaging, I think, in a kind of political, very effective political activism in Canada. You ended by saying innovative government structures are challenging the rigid boundaries of the Canadian federal system. And again, this effectiveness in the governance. And what I'm interested in, curious about, is how does this then affect geography and territory, the mapping of Canada? Because you're talking about a political activism, an effective political activism, but that effective political activism also involves what we might call a spatial activism. So you're setting out a new way of understanding not only political realities, so nested federalism, multi-level governance, intergovernmental realities, but geographic realities as well. Governance has to do with territory, with land claims, with the Inuit map of Canada. And so I just wondered if you can speak to this relationship between governance and geography or territory, how the concepts you're putting forward might also get us to think about territory and mapping differently, and the map of Canada differently.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Nadine. That's a really important one. And I think, you know, obviously in all of these regions, you know, territory and geography and putting lines on maps is, you know, part and parcel of the land claims process from the very beginning, right? It was the land claims that kind of, in many respects, created different types of categories of land ownership. I mean, if you look at the JBNQA, for example, in Nunavik, there are 3 different categories of land within that land claim agreement. So all of the land claim agreements are aimed at creating these new geographies. And one of the interesting things, which I think you're trying to get to, is how do we sort of conceive of Inuit geographically within Canada as a whole? And I think one of the things that we see happening at the national level through organizations like Inuit Tapirut Kanatami is a renewed sense to kind of build this notion of a geographical and political space that is the homeland of Inuit in Canada. And in some ways, these different regions and their development play into that, right? I mean, they're trying to develop their own autonomy within their own regions, but at the same time, they're also working towards creating this defined and unified political space within Canada known as Inuit Nunavik. And it's really remarkable, actually, how, with all the things that are going on at the regional level, that these regions are also able to come together and sort of have this combined vision of what an Inuit geographical and territorial space will look like going into the future. Not to say that there aren't divisions and differences of opinions on that. Sometimes regional matters conflict with these kind of more national or even circumpolar concerns. But there's been a great deal of unity, I think, that's built up. And that plays into the notion of multi-level governance, because multi-level governance not only recognizes what's going on at the regional level, but it also recognizes that Inuit are a circumpolar people, that they're multi-state. I hesitate to use the word nation, but that's the word that political scientists would use, right, to describe a defined group of people. They're a multi-state nation. They exist over many nations, many countries, and they're able to, sort of come together to promote their interests on a regional, national, and a circumpolar level. So I don't know if that kind of gets your question, but that's what I see emerging.
Thank you, Gary. And before we open it up, I just want to acknowledge we have a guest from Nunavik here and also one of the negotiators for the new Inuit government in Nunavik. And maybe just a quick question, Gary, in case they would like to participate in this, is Nunavik had hoped to be the first autonomous government within a province. That was some 20 years ago. And Nunatsiavut was able to accomplish that, but Nunavik is now working very actively with Mary Simon at the helm to form some kind of new government in Nunavik. And I just wonder, and maybe to bring in our other guests, how you see this fitting within the trajectory that you're discussing in the book.
I mean, I think it's been coming for a long time. I mean, going back to the early 2000s with the report on the Nunavik Commission and this idea of creating an amalgamated governance structure, right? Inuit and Nunavik have been debating this for many decades now, and in part because they weren't able to do this in the 1970s, right? Because they had to sort of deal with their land claims issues first, and then they spent the last 30, 40 years or so trying to think about how they want to organize themselves politically. They do have regional governance, government administrative structures in place, but they tend to be very siloized. So I think the idea has always been to try and bring those together, but it's a question of how you do that and what the powers of that government is. It's gone to a referendum, a couple of referenda now, and has not been successful. But well, that's part of the political discussions, though, right? That's a normal part of the political process. People discuss, they make decisions, and then they move on and they try again. So I see that as a very healthy development. But I'd be happy to hear from Lisa if she wants to comment on how those negotiations are going.
Yeah, and I think Lisa was just appointed to a new position in the negotiations, but Lisa or Robin, if you want to jump in, otherwise we can go to the next question.
Hello.
Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Nadine. Nice to see you. So lovely to see you. And thank you so much, Gary, for your presentation. I found it so interesting and immediately thought how useful this is going to be in political science classes, where when I was a student myself, I didn't really have resources to look to when it came to these types of subjects. So I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you. And as the negotiator now for our work on self-determination in Nunavik, I can really relate to the things that you've mentioned, and especially in relation to Quebec and its own dreams of nationalism. But over decades and decades, our Inuit leaders have had to work with Quebec leaders and to carry on
Quick interruption, Lisa. I'm so
close
sorry.
connection with
Lisa,
Quebec.
it seems
So,
that your microphone.
we do have things in common that we all can relate to in Quebec.
Lisa, can you hear me?
Between, you know, the Quebec
Lisa?
leaders and Inuit leaders. So we can often achieve common understandings. At the same time, we have to push for recognition of our inherent right to self-determination and the need to recognize that at all levels, provincially and nationally. So there are challenges, as you've explained very well, in nested federalism. So we have begun a new approach, and the work towards self-determination began again in Nunavik over a year ago. Actually, a few years ago now, when a task force was set up to draft a Nunavik constitution. So we do now have a draft constitution that we're working with, and as well as the work to gain jurisdiction in different levels of our lives, actually to exercise jurisdiction, such as in child and family services that we'd like to push forward, but in all other areas of our lives too. And so slowly but surely, it takes a long time. I particularly heard you say that we've been working at it for a very long time, but we still haven't achieved our self-government. But I think we can only do that a step at a time. And seeing that when in 1975, self-government could not even be put at the table, I think we've gone a very long way. So thank you for this opportunity to say so.
You're very welcome. And I think one of the things that came across in the research that we did was just the persistence and the determination and the patience that the Inuit have shown over time in dealing with some very difficult circumstances and contexts, and slowly moving forward, and that's also taught me a lot in how to deal with leadership issues in my own life outside of my research, is to adopt a more sort of patient and pragmatic, determined approach. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe just one more question, and there's one here from David Secord. Could you please talk about the devolution of province-like authority over Crown land to the 3 territories? Since this has now happened in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, but it's still unfolding in Nunavut, it would seem to affect your practical definition of nested governance over time and offer some comparative lessons.
Yeah, I think that's been, in the case of the Inuit settlement region, that's been a really important dynamic. And that sort of happened very recently in 2013 and onwards, right? So it's a very recent development that happened actually when we were doing the research and talking with territorial officials. It was kind of one of these changing circumstances, moving target, really. I mean, I can't, the Inuit final agreement kind of lays out the sort of territorial dimensions of the Inuit settlement region. But in a more general sense, I think the notion of devolution is somewhat of a complicating factor in some ways, because the territorial government, having recently acquired these kind of province-like powers, is now somewhat reluctant in a way to devolve powers further down to the regional level. So, and that's, I guess that is understandable in some respects. The territorial government sees itself as the the guardian of all people living within the territory. So that it doesn't just pertain to lands and crown lands, but it also pertains to other policy areas too, which the territorial government has recently, sort of taken on as a result of devolution.
Thank you, Gary. Well, we are at time. There's another question from Andre, but perhaps he can send it to you privately. And I just want to thank you again, Gary, for a fantastic presentation, fantastic contribution to the field, and excited for what comes next. So thank you so much, and thank everyone online for being with us. And we hope we see you at the Don Alper Book Talk in May, Bridging the Longest Border, and otherwise at our other events. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.